Hi everyone, my name's Sam. I'm a sports doctor and sports surgeon and medical director of a company called Return2Play. We work with almost 60 schools now actually in the UK, helping them manage all types of injuries, but concussion, as you can imagine, has become one of our big topics of conversation. Going to really quickly cover some info on concussion just so we have a bit of a baseline. I whistled through it with the boys this morning, and as Tom says, they were really engaged, which was great. So I'll be really quick just so we're all on the same page, and then talk about the work we're doing with UR7s to enable us to manage your boys' injuries as best as we can. Always like to mention when we start off conversations about injuries and sort of scary stuff that we must balance that with a discussion about all the benefits sports brings. I'm sure you're all very much aware of the less tangible things that sports gives our children, but also of course physical and mental well-being that it's proven to provide. So while we're going to discuss the perhaps scary topic of concussion, it's worth bearing in mind that certainly in my opinion the balance of the benefits sports brings is very much there. Also worth mentioning that concussion is not a rugby injury. It's an injury that can happen anywhere. In fact, A&E data says it happens more outside of sport than in sport. But no matter where concussions occur, and no doubt your boy at one point will have a concussion outside of rugby, we should still think about how we manage their return to sport. So very quickly and very simply, what causes a concussion? Our knowledge of concussion has changed hugely over the last few years. That's really why we're now talking about it. We didn't used to think it mattered at all, and now we do. And also our knowledge about what causes a concussion has changed hugely. You do not have to have a direct head blow to cause a concussion. Concussion is a whiplash type injury. It's the brain shaking around inside the skull. So anything that causes the brain to shake can cause a concussion. And actually in children, it's far more common for the concussion to be non-direct head blow related. So from a heavy tackle, making the head shake can cause a concussion. What's actually happening inside the brain? Well, the reality is, unfortunately, we're still not really sure. It isn't a brain bruising, it isn't a brain bleed. You'll still see pictures online of the brain shaking around inside the skull and sort of bruising on the front of it. We don't believe that's concussion. If you cut open a brain after concussion, you wouldn't be able to see anything with the naked eye. What we think is the nerves are getting stretched. Obviously, nerves are very small and fragile, and that upsets them for a bit and takes a bit of time for them to then start recovering. The key thing to talk about is how we recognise a concussion. We talked to the boys this morning in a bit more detail about how they can put their hand up and say when they think they've had an injury, and also look after their teammates when they think their teammates have had an injury. But of course, really important that you as parents know how we recognise it too, both so you can understand perhaps decision making of coaches, and also when your child gets home, so that you can make some decisions yourself. I actually believe the decision making around concussion is really simple. We have to accept that at the moment we don't have all the answers. We have to accept that there isn't a magic test that we can do to prove someone's concussion. All we have to do is ask ourselves two questions. One, has the mode of injury, could that have caused a concussion? We've just talked about what caused a concussion, so we're looking for either that direct head blow or a violent shaking of the head, and then have there been any signs or symptoms that would fit with a concussion, and we'll look at those in a moment. But really, that second point is as simple as, are they then behaving and feeling normally after that head shake? If we answer yes to those two questions, then our suspicion is raised that this is a concussion, and certainly on the pitch side, we follow the rules. If in doubt, sit them out. The risks of carrying on do not outweigh the benefits, and therefore we remove them from play and we seek medical attention, or medical advice at least. What does concussion look and feel like? The reality is that it's a very broad area. The traditional things, headache, dizziness, sickness, are certainly all there, but there are also a lot more vague symptoms. If you can see the little things there, you'll notice that a lot of those teenage boys suffer from on a day-to-day basis. So it does make it difficult to balance out, well, is this really a concussion, or is this just how they're feeling normally? Generally, we go on the rule as there been a change over since the head knock, but it can be difficult. But again, if we have suspicion, then it's not worth the risk to ignore it. To make it even more difficult, because there are all those different types of vague symptoms, we know that in some cases symptoms can get better very quickly, and that does not mean it wasn't a concussion. We now believe that no matter how quickly someone gets better, ignoring people that take a long time to get better where there are other problems, generally the same process is going on inside the head. And for some reason, some people feel better very quickly, but that doesn't mean the brain's back to normal. So no matter how quickly the symptoms resolve, we still should treat that as a concussion. And that causes a lot of problems when we're managing concussions in schools, you get a lot of people saying, but he was fine within an hour, or the next day was absolutely fine. Is it really necessary to follow these rules? And the answer very much from the medical side is yes, it's very important we follow the rules. We also know that symptoms can be delayed, which makes it very difficult and makes it even more important that parents are aware of the symptoms. Not uncommon at all for an injury to happen on a Saturday, kid to feel fine that evening, and on Sunday and on returning to school on the Monday, that's when the symptoms come on. And that's because the brain's been able to rest after the injury, and then when we provoke it, when we try and make it do work at school on a Monday morning, that's when the symptoms start to happen. Very easy to miss those, so important we just bear it in mind if you think there's been a head knock or a violent shaking, to keep an eye on someone for a few days before ruling out the injury. And as already mentioned by Tom, doctors aren't always helpful in the process. Very much not a criticism from me at all. We cannot expect all doctors to know everything, and certainly can't expect to know sporting guidelines on certain types of injuries, but very often we see the wrong advice being given, which again can cause a bit of a clash between schools and parents of when there are clear guidelines about how we're supposed to manage it and doctors say something else. That makes it very difficult for us to deal with. So the scary stuff, unfortunately, why does any of this matter? Of course, if there were no risks to managing concussion poorly, then it wouldn't matter at all. We'd still be doing what we did 20, 30 years ago for the injury, which was pretty much ignore it. But unfortunately, we now know that there are risks, and the really important thing to bear in mind that the risks come from not managing the injury well. The risk from a one-off concussion that's managed properly are almost non-existent. Pretty much everyone gets better with good management, and the long-term risks aren't that high. It's managing it poorly that we want to prevent. And that's because when the brain has had an injury, if we allow it to have further injuries, then there's a spiraling cascade of things getting worse and worse and long-term harm being possible. I split the risks into two: immediate risks, so sort of pitch side risks, if you like, and long-term risks. Immediate risks, ignoring health side, and particularly when I'm speaking to coaches and to the boys themselves, if you've taken a knock to the head and you've got a concussion, you're not likely to be playing very well. So actually it's probably best for your team for you to be removed from play anyway. Far clearly scarier than that is the risk of death. Unfortunately, that is now a recognised risk of managing concussion poorly. There's a famous case of the boy Ben Robinson, for those that have done RFU training. It's talked about in there, and there's been a number of other documented cases since Ben who took a knock to the head, clear signs of concussion, removed from play, 10 minutes later said, "I feel fine now, sir," was put back on. That happened again, and then the third time he was put back, took a knock and died on the pitch. Clearly devastating, clearly something we all want to avoid. Also, unbelievably rare. Just applying common sense, we didn't all drop down dead playing rugby 10 years ago when we were ignoring concussion. So very, very unusual, but of course now that we recognise that's a risk, it's something that we cannot ignore. And then there's more the long-term risks, delayed recovery. So we tend to say that people can recover from a concussion, or their symptoms should go away within 7 to 10 days. With children, we've now expanded that to say within 30 days. So that's a reasonably long time of normal recovery. But we know that if we don't follow the advice of resting and staying away from sport, that recovery can be delayed by months and even years, which obviously can start impacting on ability to play sport, but also academics, which obviously is important for children. And then we have the possible link with neurodegenerative problems. So there's been lots of stuff in the press about links with dementia and Parkinson's. Actually, a lot of it's come from football more than rugby. The reality is the jury's very much still out on all of that. It's a bit of a confused picture, but growing sort of concern that there are risks, again from multiple hits to the head without the brain being allowed to cover. If you look at American footballers, where a lot of the concern has come from, hitting their heads day in, day out, very different picture to what we're talking about in rugby with children, where hopefully the knocks are very much occasional. And there's also shown to be evidence of risk of other types of injury when people play sport with concussions. So that's why it's important we get it right. So what do we do when we think a child has a concussion? Well, as hopefully many of you are aware, there are guidelines that we now follow. Those aren't rugby's guidelines. Those guidelines now apply to all sport across England, for children anyway. There are slightly different guidelines for adults across sports, but for children, pretty simple. Everyone should follow the same rules. And really with those guidelines, we're saying that sport is now safer. We now can manage this injury properly. We shouldn't be scared. If we do it right, then people should get better and we shouldn't have long-term concerns. Just some theory behind those guidelines for you, because it causes quite a lot of confusion and sometimes a bit of aggravation between doctor and coaches and doctor and patients. This is the reason why the guidelines are what they are. So there's a period of rest, and the reason for that is only rest allows the brain to get better. When those nerves get upset, it takes a lot of energy to reset the chemical balance inside the brain, and only rest allows that to happen. And also, rest keeps us away from activities generally that would get us knocking our heads again. Having said that, I have had lots of cases where kids during their rest period have fallen over and banged their head on the bed or whatever. You can't avoid everything, but generally keeping away from active activity helps you prevent knocking your head again. There are set time frames in recovery. That can cause a lot of frustration because people say, well, I feel better, why aren't I allowed to get back earlier? As we've discussed, people feeling better isn't necessarily the same as their brain recovering, and there's sort of a bit of safety netting put in with those time frames. And then we have a process of gradually returning to sport rather than just throwing someone back onto a pitch, and that's because in certain cases people feel better and then exercise provokes their symptoms coming back. So that the exercise gradually returning to sports sort of is a test really to make sure that symptoms aren't coming back and to prove to us that they are better. Those are what the guidelines look like in terms of numbers. For children, a minimum of 23 days off sport. That feels like a long time when you're a kid. As adults, we know that 23 days is not a long time at all. If you sprained your ankle, you'd be out for longer than 23 days. So it's really important that if a concussion does happen, we allay the fears of the child and make sure they realise that this isn't the end of the world. They will get better, and they're far, far safer looking after their brains now than having problems later on. I realise that is a really whistle-stop tour of concussions, but just to summarise, risks arise when concussions are not managed well, and that's why it's important we all work together to make sure that if there is an injury, we do manage it properly. Suspicion equals diagnosis until proven otherwise. Just to tell you that 99% of the time, if someone comes to me with a suspicion, that means that they've said there's been a knock and there's been a shake and there have been symptoms. For me, that's a diagnosis. So, but I understand why people want a doctor to make that call rather than them. Symptoms going away doesn't mean the brain's better, and we know that seeking expertise early improves recovery because there are ways to treat certain symptoms, and there is advice that can be given in certain ways. And always important to remember that although we discuss scary stuff, sport has huge benefits. As Tom said, the boys were really engaged this morning and asked some questions that I thought worth sharing for you. And these are questions I get a lot from parents in clinic. One, should I wear a scrum cap? There is no evidence that scrum caps prevent concussions. In children under 15, the evidence suggests that they're more at risk of a concussion wearing a scrum cap than not. And that's probably because of some sort of false sense of security and putting their heads in silly places because they feel they're protected. If you compare a scrum cap to an American football helmet, American football has one of the highest rates of concussion and they've got massive helmets on. So there is no evidence that scrum caps help. Cuts, bruises, cauliflower ears, yeah, but concussion not. Should I avoid screen time? Always an excited question from a parent when their kids just had a concussion. Can I stop them playing Xbox? Can I take their phone away? And they're always very upset when I say, actually, personally, I don't think there's much benefit of it. There is a big crossover with concussion, particularly in children, concussion recovery and psychological injury. With children, there's very often the symptoms are emotional, so they get more upset easily, they get more angry easily, they have trouble sleeping. They're not sort of physical symptoms in the same way, and actually removing joy, and unfortunately, perhaps too strong, but for children now there's a lot of joy that comes from, and interaction with the world comes from their screen time, actually I don't think is hugely helpful. So my rule is, if it makes them feel worse, then obviously it's sensible not to do, but if they feel fine doing it, then that's okay. And then a big one, if I have multiple concussions, will I be forced to stop playing? The answer is no. If you seek expertise and see people that know what they're talking about, of course we have concerns around multiple concussions, but each concussion should be treated on a case-by-case basis. There's no sort of you've had 3, 4, 5, that's you out. It very much depends on how you've recovered. Are there any questions specifically on concussion before I just talk a bit about what Return2Play is doing with UR7s? I'll hang around for a bit afterwards, so if anyone's got any specific questions.
With regards to multiple concussions,
yeah.
Is it the way that it's reported, but there have been a few sort of fairly high profile last season, so George North springs to mind where they're saying, well, if he has another one, that's it.
Yeah.
Is that just the way it's been reported?
A little bit, and we really make our decisions on how your recovery changes. So if your first concussion, it takes you 2 days to get better, your second concussion, it's 2 weeks, your third concussion, it's 2 months, and that's sort of the George North story, then you're getting increasingly concerned the brain's not happy. Actually, in children, we tend to see far more often that their recoveries are pretty similar no matter what, and that's reassuring. It's saying the brain seems to be coping fine. So that's why I say it depends on a case by case. There's no doubt that we're seeing more of the problems happening from multiple concussions. That's really just because of more awareness, in my opinion, about the issues. Anyone else? What's the work Return2Play doing? Maybe some of the schools your boys go to already work with us. There's two main ways we try and help manage injuries, and that's all injuries, not just concussion. One is really the administrative side, so we have a software and injury management tool that all your boys will be signed up to through Return2Play, so you'll get access to that software and you'll be able to link, they'll automatically link to UR7s, but then you'll be able to link your schools and clubs and individual people to them as you see fit. And what that allows is for when injuries are recorded, for there to be communication between all those people, just so everyone's aware an injury's happened. You can record those injuries when they're not at UR7s, obviously, and then UR7s know that there's been an injury and know how to, whether to expect them or how they should be managing them when they're at camps or at sessions. For concussion specifically, what that also allows is linking with our doctors. So the second part of our service is direct access to expertise. So we have a bank of sports doctors that provide medical assessments. 90% of that now is done through a telemedicine system, which means that you can access a doctor any day of the week to talk about concussion, to review an injury, to make that diagnosis if that's felt it's required, but also then that doctor will manage their return to play afterwards. So make sure they're following all those rules, give the advice about those adaptations to life that may improve recovery, and importantly, make the call about when they're safe to return to play, such that that risk is minimised as much as possible about returning and further head knocks. What the system also allows is the sort of bigger picture analysis for the likes of UR7s and for schools to look at injury data in more detail and try and work out, well, how can we start preventing these injuries happening in the first place? The unfortunate reality is that a lot of concussions are just bad luck. In the heat of a game, your head gets in the wrong place, you take a knock. But there are definite trends you can start to see once you start tracking these injuries and how they happen. So that's sort of the bigger picture behind the scenes, how we hope to use that data. And also what it provides for your boys who are sort of the younger end of the UR7s is us over time to see their injuries, to keep track if they're having multiple concussions, but also other types of injuries. Are they getting a groin strain every pre-season? Do we need to look at how we can improve S&C to prevent them getting that further on, to make their sport life in general, but certainly their rugby lives, as pain-free and healthy as we can. I think that's it, is it all?
Yeah, that's it. So just the way that this will work, we are, I suppose we and Return2Play are investing in the system for all of the boys in UR7s. And that will then, so the administrative side and tracking all of that and letting know all of your other coaches will be part of that, so you'll be registered to that, and then there will be an opt-in. And the opt-in is as simple as that for, I believe it's going to be £15 for the year to have access to the doctors. Okay, so there's just that bit there. We'll do the first bit, and then we'll say to you, if you want to, and if you see value in it, then there is that opt-in for that process. Just a little bit from us, and I said it to the boys about sevens, there's often a little bit of and I say to the lads, show of hands, what's safer, sevens or 15s? They all say sevens is safer. And in theory, there are less contacts or less opportunities for contact on the sevens field than there are on the 15s field. Absolutely, game shorter, blah, 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 blah. But when in one-on-one situations, we could be in 15s, we could be in sevens. Your head could end up on the wrong side of a tackle, your head could end up in a ruck. You could be at training. And I tell a quick story. Last year, we do a 1200 metre test here, which is an endurance VO2 test. The boys are not even travelling particularly quickly. Their aim is to run it in under 5 minutes. A lad last year from an unsaid school, because I'll get on to why, was on the 1200 metre test. He turned, hit the line, accelerated off of the line, wasn't looking, rose his head, smashed his head straight into my shoulder. Knocked himself out in the 1200 metre test. Call parent, sorry, son's been knocked out, got to go home. Concussion program, absolutely. Got a phone call from the school coach 5 days later. Was he definitely concussed? He was knocked out. Was he definitely concussed? He was knocked out. Okay? So, whilst there has been a huge amount of further understanding, I think, there are also, and I'm not saying that this coach wanted it to not be concussed, but there are also people and coaches and managers and all sorts of people that will ask those questions. Was he knocked out? Was he concussed? And for us, the safest and easiest way for us to do that is go, yes, diagnosed by, here's all the data, send it straight over, everyone's got all of the information. It kind of takes out the question marks and also the he said, she said between coaches. I think all of the boys here will play at different models, be it club, academy, school, and all will have different reasons for doing so, and linking all of those up is somewhere where I think we have an opportunity to do so. So over the next couple of weeks, you will receive further details on Return to Play and how it will work for us, and the option to opt in. And like I say, there's absolutely no pressure on our part from that. It's just if that's something that you see that there's value. In some cases, in some schools, Return to Play will either already be in school, or there might already be a sports doctor that they have access to immediately, so that's fine. In other cases, and we've talked about it today, that sports doctor might be the matron who's been there for 35 years, and she might not be an expert in head concussions. So it's completely up to you.